Hi there. I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
Christmas dinner had always been a performance in our house. A carefully orchestrated ballet of forced smiles, dry turkey, and the kind of passive-aggressive small talk that could drive a person to insanity if you weren't already numb to it. My mother, Linda, had gone all out this year like she always did. Table set with her great-aunt's china, those ridiculous silver napkin rings shaped like angels, and a centerpiece so overloaded with fake cranberries and cinnamon sticks, it looked like a Pinterest board had thrown up. The smell of cloves and cooked ham hung heavy in the air, and the fire crackled behind my father's recliner, like it was trying to warn us that something was about to combust. We were all there. Me, of course, the temporary guest, who had been living in the guest bedroom for 3 years after a layoff I couldn't bounce back from fast enough. My brother Ben, who flew in from Austin every December just long enough to parade his success around like a Macy's float. His wife Candace, surgically sweet with a wine glass never far from her hand. And my parents, Tom and Linda, sitting at opposite ends of the table like bookends to a story that had been slowly rotting from the inside for decades. It was halfway through the meal, right after my mom asked if anyone wanted more stuffing, that the bomb dropped. My dad, fork in one hand, glass of red in the other, cleared his throat loudly. His signature move when he was about to say something he thought was profound, but was almost always cruel, and said loud enough to cut through the Bing Crosby playing in the background. "You know, Megan, you've been here long enough. I think it's time you moved out. You're not a kid anymore. Frankly, it's become a burden." For a few seconds, all you could hear was the clink of my fork dropping onto my plate. No one else said a word. My mother didn't gasp or object. Ben kept chewing, barely raising an eyebrow. Candace sipped her wine like it was tea in a British crime drama, and she didn't want to get involved. I looked at my dad, and for the first time in a long time, I really looked at him. The deep lines on his face weren't just from age. They were carved from years of disappointment, expectations never met, and a need for control he'd long since stopped hiding. I could have said a lot of things in that moment. I could have reminded him of the time I bailed him out when his credit card got frozen because he refused to learn online banking, or how, for the past 3 years, every utility, every internet bill, even the trash pickup was paid out of my account, quietly, automatically, because I didn't want to hear him gripe about tech crap. I could have pointed out that the reason the thermostat worked was because I bought it, that the Netflix account they used religiously every night had my name on it. I could have screamed, cried, thrown my wine in his face, walked out in a dramatic whirlwind that would have made Candace finally blink. But I didn't. I just nodded once, picked up my fork, and kept eating. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed and the house was still, aside from the hum of appliances I was already planning to shut down, I stood at the sink washing dishes I didn't dirty, staring out the dark window above it. I thought about all the times I'd convinced myself staying was the right thing, that I was helping, that this was what family did. My mother never asked for help, but she never stopped me from giving it. My dad never said thank you, but he sure enjoyed the working heat and clean laundry. And me, I told myself it was temporary, that I just needed to get back on my feet, but I hadn't moved forward in 3 years. Because deep down, I knew the truth. They liked me stuck, because it made them feel better about their own lives, and I let them until now. I dried the last plate, wiped down the counter, and took one last look at the perfect little Christmas table. My father's wine glass still had a lipstick mark on it, my mom's. A matching set even in silence. I whispered, "All right, old man, you want me gone, I'll go. But not before I take everything I came with and everything I built for you while you looked right through me." That night, I started making a list. Not of what I'd pack, but what I'd disconnect. The water, the gas, the electric, internet, Netflix, Amazon Prime, Spotify, even the pest control contract I'd signed in my name. I paid for everything because it was easier than asking him to understand a password reset. You want to know what it's like to be treated like a freeloader when you've been the invisible backbone of a household? It's like building a house out of matchsticks, one careful stick at a time, only for the man who lives in it to strike a match and ask why it's so damn flammable. So I nodded, and I planned, and I waited for the right moment to burn it all down, one unpaid bill at a time. The thing people never tell you about being called a burden is that it doesn't happen all at once. Not in one dramatic explosion across a dinner table or during some drunken argument that leaves dishes shattered and relationships hanging by threads. It creeps in slowly, like a leak in the roof you don't notice until the whole ceiling caves in. And by the time someone finally says the word out loud, you've already been drowning in the weight of it for years. That Christmas dinner, that pointed remark from my father that landed like a rusty nail through the center of the holiday roast, wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the confirmation of something I had already felt every single day since I moved back in after losing my job, my apartment, and if I'm being honest, most of my confidence in how my life was supposed to look by the time I hit 30. 3 years earlier, I had walked through that same front door with a single suitcase, a busted laptop, and a promise to myself that this was temporary, just a subwoofer, a place to catch my breath and rebuild after the company I worked for, downsized half its staff, and left me with a severance check that barely covered a month's rent. My parents didn't hesitate when I asked to stay. My mom opened the guest room with fresh sheets, fluffed pillows, and a pot roast in the oven. My dad gave me a silent nod and went back to watching his baseball game, which in his language meant, "Calm, but don't make a mess." I told myself I'd be out in 6 months. I even set reminders on my phone. 6 months to find a job, 6 months to save enough to move out, 6 months to start over, but 6 months turned into 9, then into a year, then into 3. And in that time, while the world outside moved on, I became a sort of household ghost. Someone who paid the bills but never quite belonged. Someone who cooked dinner 5 nights a week but never got asked how her day went. Someone who got up early to shovel the driveway and came home late from job interviews that led nowhere, only to find that my dad had, once again, left a pile of unopened mail on the kitchen table and used my clean laundry as a coaster for his beer. They never asked me to pay rent. They never had to. I started covering things out of guilt, then out of habit, then out of necessity, because Tom, my father, didn't believe in throwing money at problems, which was rich coming from a man who hadn't looked at a bill in years. The power in my name. Water, gas, trash, cable, internet, mine. I took over the Netflix account after he got locked out and refused to call customer service. I set up online bill pay because he kept missing due dates and blaming the postal service. I bought the new water heater after the old one gave out in the middle of February, and I even replaced the dishwasher when it started leaking and my mom got on her knees to catch the water with a mixing bowl. They never offered to pay me back. I never asked. That was the quiet arrangement we fell into. My support in exchange for the roof, but they never stopped treating me like I was still 16 and grounded for sneaking out to a concert. Every decision I made was met with a raised eyebrow or a scoff. I brought home groceries, and he criticized what I bought. I applied to jobs he didn't understand, and he called them fake internet careers. I fixed things around the house, and he took the credit when guests noticed. And slowly, without realizing it, I let it happen. I absorbed the blame, the guilt, the rolled eyes, and heavy sighs, because deep down, I thought I deserved it. I thought I hadn't earned the right to stand up for myself until I had a full-time job and my own apartment and could say, "See, I made it." But the truth is, people like my dad never think you've earned anything unless it fits into their narrow idea of what success looks like, preferably something they can explain to their buddies at the golf course or brag about at family reunions. To him, Ben was the successful one, the son with a tech job, a mortgage, and a wife who knew how to make everything look like it belonged in a magazine spread. Never mind that Ben hadn't visited once in over a year before this Christmas. Never mind that when my mom had surgery last spring, it was me who drove her to every appointment, filled her prescriptions, cleaned up her vomit, and sat by her bed for 5 straight nights. None of that counted. I was still the one sleeping in the room with the floral bedspread and the dresser that smelled like mothballs. So when he called me a burden at the table, it didn't shock me. It just stripped away the last excuse I had for staying. It made everything real in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. And as I packed my things the next morning, folding clothes into boxes and unplugging the lamp I bought during my second year of college, I realized how much of this house had slowly become mine. How many of the working parts, the functioning pieces, the things that kept it warm and livable, were tied to me, not emotionally, logistically. That was when the idea started forming, not out of spite, not yet, but out of this sharp, sudden clarity. I wasn't just leaving, I was unplugging, disconnecting, extracting myself completely from the system I'd been holding together and with duct tape and autopay for far too long. And if they didn't want me there, fine. But they'd better learn real fast what it costs to run a house when the so-called burden walks out with the power lines in her back pocket. The first thing I did that morning wasn't cry or rage or even finish packing. I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm coffee and opened my laptop, the same aging device I'd been using since my second job in marketing. Back when life had a certain rhythm and I thought hard work naturally led to stability, not to burnout, breakdowns, and eventually moving back into the house where you were last grounded for sneaking out to meet a boy who didn't even remember your name the next week. The morning sun streamed through the cracked blinds, casting long, narrow beams across the cluttered table, the kind of clutter that only appears when no one's really been paying attention for a long time. A scattering of unopened mail, expired coupons, a half-empty bottle of Tums, and one of Dad's yellow legal pads with scribbles about a car repair he never scheduled. I opened a blank Google Doc and began making a list. Not the kind you keep for yourself quietly, but a list with weight, with sharp corners, with consequences. Every single account I'd opened, every bill I'd taken responsibility for, every service they'd grown to depend on while telling themselves I was doing nothing, was written down meticulously. Electricity through mid-state power, my name, my autopay, my responsibility. Internet through Rapidcom, high-speed, wireless, with the upgraded router I paid extra for, so my dad could stream old war documentaries in HD, and my mom could video call her sister in Tucson without buffering every 5 seconds. Gas and water through the county utilities office, both running like clockwork on my card. Never a missed payment because I made sure of it. Trash service, streaming subscriptions, Amazon Prime. I even had the pest control guy coming every other month because my mom once saw a spider the size of a nickel in the laundry room and refused to do laundry for a week. And then there was the thermostat, the smart one I bought during a Black Friday sale, installed myself after watching 3 YouTube tutorials, and connected to my phone so I could adjust the temperature when Dad accidentally left the heat blasting while they went out for the day. That thermostat was synced to my email, my password, my settings. Without me, it was just a shiny plastic rectangle on the wall, a reminder of comfort they didn't know how to maintain. It was almost amusing, in a sick sort of way, to see just how deeply I'd embedded myself into the infrastructure of this house. Not emotionally, not sentimentally, but practically, invisibly, completely. I had become the silent engine that kept things running, the background process that no one notices until it stops. And for all the cold stares and muttered judgments, they had never once stopped to ask how the light stayed on, or why the fridge always worked, or who kept the trash from overflowing. And now, sitting there with the weight of their rejection still buzzing in the back of my mind like a dull headache, I realized I could make it all go away with a few clicks. The power of invisibility is that it comes with a switch, and I was ready to flip it. So I started with the basics. Logged into the Mid-State Power portal, canceled the autopay, scheduled a service disconnection for 48 hours later, just enough time for me to be out, just enough time for them to feel the sting without any warning. Then the gas, the water, the trash pickup. I canceled the internet with a short, polite note to the provider, thanking them for their service and requesting a final bill. I logged out of the streaming services, changed passwords, revoked device access. I called the pest control company and told them to cancel all future visits. I even unsubscribed the house from the weekly produce delivery my mom had grown to rely on, which I'd quietly added 2 years ago when she started saying the store was too much of a hassle. By the time I was finished, the silence in the kitchen felt different. Not empty, empowered. I went back upstairs, packed the rest of my clothes, removed my name from the bedroom door they'd never bothered to take it off of since childhood, and unplugged the mini fridge in the garage I'd bought when theirs stopped working and Dad refused to waste money replacing it. That fridge, filled with soda, beer, and those weird frozen egg sandwiches he liked, would be going with me. I'd bought it. I'd earned it. Let him figure out how to keep his Michelob cold without it. It wasn't anger that guided me, not really. It was clarity. There's a strange peace in knowing you don't owe anyone a damn thing anymore, in recognizing that the version of you they pretend exists, the freeloading daughter, the perpetual child, the burden, has nothing to do with who you actually are. And once you stop arguing with their image of you, once you stop trying to earn back love they only give in conditional, ration doses, you're free to act with precision, with intention. The next morning, I packed up my car while the house was still asleep. I didn't slam any doors or throw a fit. I moved like a ghost, careful and efficient, closing cabinets gently, unplugging devices without a sound, locking up behind me. And just before I left, I set one final note on the kitchen table, scribbled on the back of an old electric bill. All it said was, "Everything in my name has been canceled. Good luck." I didn't wait for the reaction. I didn't need to see my father's face go pale when the lights shut off, or my mother's panic when the internet died during one of her morning news videos. I didn't need to hear them argue over who would fix it, or what had happened, or how ungrateful I was for leaving. I didn't need to be there, because I knew. I knew exactly what that kind of silence sounds like. It's the sound of a house slowly realizing that the ghost was the one keeping it alive all along. By the time the first real consequence hit, I was already 2 towns away, sipping burnt diner coffee in a booth that smelled faintly of mop water and old bacon, watching the sun stretch across the flat gray sky like it had no idea what sort of chaos it was about to shine down on. The waitress, a tired woman with too much mascara and a kindness that came from surviving more than she'd probably ever say out loud, asked me twice if I wanted anything besides toast and eggs, and I shook my head both times. Not because I wasn't hungry, but because I wasn't sure if I could eat without the tightness in my chest cracking open and spilling everything I had kept buttoned up for the past 72 hours. There's something about sitting in a space that doesn't belong to anyone you know that makes everything feel lighter, like the air isn't pressing against your decisions, like the world might actually make room for you again. Meanwhile, back at the house, the one I had carefully disconnected from myself like a surgeon cutting ties to a no longer viable organ, things were unraveling and not quietly. According to the text messages I started receiving around noon, the first thing they noticed was the thermostat blinking an error message, followed by the Wi-Fi going out mid-morning, which apparently sent my dad into a mild panic spiral because he couldn't access his usual news stream or weather updates. My mother texted me at least 6 times within a half hour, all increasingly frantic. "The internet is down, did you pay the bill?" Followed by, "Your dad says the heat isn't working, what's going on?" And finally, in a flurry of barely punctuated digital anxiety, "Please call me, we don't know what's happening, the power is flickering now, and the kitchen smells like gas." I didn't respond, not because I wanted to be cruel, not yet, but because I needed them to sit with the uncertainty for just a little while longer, to feel even a fraction of what I'd felt every day for the last 3 years, wondering when something I had quietly, selflessly managed would stop working and I'd be blamed for the fallout, as if I hadn't been holding everything together with duct tape and patience for far too long. There's something almost biblical in the moment you let chaos happen and don't rush in to clean it up. When you realize that saving people who refuse to acknowledge your sacrifices isn't noble, it's just another kind of self-erasure. By late afternoon, the texts had stopped. I figured they'd finally figured out the truth, or more likely, my father had decided this was some kind of ploy for attention and started muttering about entitled behavior and teaching her a lesson, as if I hadn't already learned every lesson in the book of familial guilt and quiet endurance. The thing about men like him is that they mistake silence for compliance and think control is the same thing as respect. And so when the systems they never understood stopped responding, his first instinct wouldn't have been to reflect. It would have been to blame. The next morning, I woke up to a single voicemail from my mom. Her voice shaky, distant, as if she'd already cried, but wasn't going to show it. She said the house was freezing, said the food in the fridge had gone bad overnight, said Dad had tried calling the utility company, but because none of the accounts were in his name, they wouldn't give him any information, said they didn't know what to do. And then, right at the end, barely a whisper, she asked, "Are you really gone?" I deleted the message. There's something liberating about hearing the desperation in a voice that once ignored yours, about realizing that your absence has weight and that maybe, for once, your silence might carry more power than all the begging, apologizing, and over-explaining you did just to be seen. I didn't block her. Not yet. But I wasn't ready to step back into that house of ghosts, just to perform the role of the invisible fixer one more time. Later that day, I found myself scrolling through old emails, looking for something. I don't even know what. Maybe some trace of the person I was before all of this. Before the need to be useful overtook the need to be happy. I found a message I'd sent myself years ago, a digital sticky note with a job application draft attached. And in the body of the email, a line I had copied from some long-forgotten motivational speaker. You do not owe your survival to the people who watched you drown and called it discipline. I read that sentence 5 times. Then I copied it into a new note, sent it to my mom's phone, and turned mine off. At some point, my brother Ben called. He left a voicemail that started friendly, casual even, as if he wasn't trying to navigate a minefield. He said Dad was taking it hard, that Mom was worried sick, and that while he understood my frustration, maybe I had gone a bit far and could consider coming back to at least talk things out. It was delivered in that smug middle manager tone of his that made it sound like he was resolving a minor HR issue, rather than trying to understand the years of slow suffocation I'd endured in that house. I didn't answer him either, because I wasn't angry, not in the way he assumed. What I felt was more complex, heavier, and quieter, like the settling of dust after a long overdue demolition. They'd built a life around pretending I wasn't essential, and now, without me, the foundation was crumbling. And that wasn't vengeance. That was reality. By the end of the week, my mom sent one last message. Your father's been having chest pains. We're going to the hospital. I looked at the screen for a long time. I imagined the scene. The emergency room, the fluorescent lights, my mother's trembling hands, my father's pride quietly withering as he lay on a gurney, realizing that the world might continue spinning whether or not he got the last word. Then, with a breath I didn't realize I was holding, I pressed delete again. Not out of hate, but out of freedom. Because sometimes walking away isn't about winning. It's about no longer agreeing to lose. By the time I finally turned the car onto the familiar street, lined with aging maples whose branches stretched like tired fingers toward the sky, it had been exactly 9 days since I left without looking back. 9 days since I packed my life into the trunk of a borrowed sedan and erased myself from the fabric of a house that, for all its peeling paint and weathered brick, had once felt like the only thing still tethering me to a version of reality I could almost recognize. I hadn't come back out of guilt, and certainly not out of some naive hope for reconciliation. No, what pulled me back was something colder, quieter, the kind of obligation that doesn't come from love, but from a lingering echo of who I used to be when I still believed that family meant something more than shared blood and old grievances wrapped in cheap tinsel. The house looked smaller than I remembered, somehow sunken into itself, as if the structure had felt my absence and slumped under the weight of its own delusions. The lights were off despite the gray chill in the air, and the once neatly trimmed hedges now stood wild and unkempt, as though even the front lawn had stopped trying to impress the neighborhood. I parked at the curb without turning off the engine, letting the hum of it vibrate through the steering wheel while I stared at the windows I used to clean every spring, waiting for something, anything that would make this feel like a home again instead of a monument to everything I had survived. My mother answered the door wearing the same pale cardigan she'd had for at least a decade, the fabric frayed at the elbows and pilled across the chest, her face drawn tight with exhaustion and something else I couldn't quite place. Regret maybe, or fear, or the kind of grief that doesn't have a name because the person it's mourning hasn't actually died. She didn't hug me, she didn't speak right away. She just stepped aside and let me walk in, the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet louder than I remembered, like the house itself was protesting my return. Inside, it was cold, not just physically, though the absence of heating was immediately noticeable, but emotionally, atmospherically, as if the air had been drained of warmth and replaced with a silence so thick it felt like wading through fog. The living room was dim, the curtains still closed, and the smell of stale coffee and dust clung to every surface like a reminder of time. Refusing to move forward, my mother gestured toward the couch but didn't sit down. She stood behind it, arms crossed, eyes flicking between me and the hallway, like she wasn't sure if she wanted me to see what waited at the end of it. "He's in the back room," she said eventually, her voice barely above a whisper, raw around the edges like she hadn't used it much in the past few days. Hasn't said much since the hospital. Just sits there, watching nothing. I didn't ask questions. I didn't offer condolences. I just nodded and walked past her, my footsteps muffled against the thinning carpet, my fingers brushing the walls I used to lean against as a child, listening for the sound of shouting or the TV turned too loud, or the slam of a door that always came with the weight of disapproval. The back room was once my father's study, though it had mostly been a catch-all for his unread newspapers and unopened mail, a space where he pretended to be more important than he was, surrounded by the detritus of authority, pens that didn't work, dusty plaques from long-forgotten office parties, old leather-bound notebooks he never wrote in but kept anyway. He was sitting in the recliner when I walked in, hunched forward, his hands clasped between his knees, the television in front of him dark and silent. He didn't turn to look at me. He didn't speak. For a long moment, I just stood there, taking in the image of this man who had spent decades believing that silence was a weapon, now suffocated by the very quiet he'd used to keep everyone in check. His skin looked pale, almost waxy, and his frame had shrunk inside his sweater, like the fabric was swallowing him whole. "You got your revenge, huh?" he said finally, his voice hoarse and distant. More statement than question, more resignation than accusation. I didn't respond right away. I didn't owe him an answer, not really. But the truth is, it wasn't revenge. Not in the cartoonish way he probably imagined it. Not some petty act of spite or a tantrum dressed up in bills and passwords. It was the only kind of justice I could afford, the only kind of power I had left, after years of being the one who fixed things no one admitted were broken, the one who kept the heat on, and the pipes flowing and the floor swept while being called lazy, ungrateful, invisible. "I didn't do it to hurt you," I said eventually, my voice steady, stripped of apology. "I did it because I was tired of pretending none of it mattered." He didn't answer, didn't even blink, just kept staring at a spot on the floor, like it held the answer to a question he'd never been brave enough to ask. I don't know what he expected me to say. Maybe he wanted some big speech, some theatrical confession, something that would turn me back into the child he could still control. But I was done performing. As I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the dark screen of the television, and for the first time in years, I didn't look like someone desperate to be understood. I looked like someone free. Back in the living room, my mother was sitting now, shoulders slumped, fingers clenched around the edge of the couch cushion, like she was trying to keep herself grounded in the middle of a storm. She didn't ask me to stay. She didn't ask where I was going. She just looked at me with that same worn expression I'd seen on her face every day of my childhood, part longing, part fear, and entirely uncertain. "You know," I said as I reached for the door, "he said I was a burden, but you let him." She didn't deny it. I didn't need her to. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken, the first hint of twilight spilling across the horizon like a bruise. I didn't know where I was headed next. My friend's guest room was temporary, the job interviews still uncertain, the future still a blur of maybes and ifs, but I knew I wasn't walking back into that house again. Not as the version of myself they'd reduced me to. As I started the car, I glanced back once, just long enough to see the front porch light flicker on, maybe from motion, maybe from timing, maybe from some residual electricity that hadn't quite drained yet. Or maybe, just maybe, even ghosts need a way to see who's finally left them behind.